Hi, I'm John Atack, and I once again welcome my very good friend, Jeffrey Augustine. Hi, Jeffrey.
Well, hi, John. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Obviously, we're both extremely troubled about what Russia is doing in the Ukraine at the moment, and it's hard not to feel deeply concerned about that. It's a profoundly irrational series of actions. But putting that aside, I wanted to say something that I've been doing this for nearly 3 years now. And we're up to 3,300 subscribers, which is fantastic. And thank you very much. But the reality is that I can't afford to pay Spike to actually edit these things. I haven't taken a penny from it in that time. And all the money goes towards preparing material. So I really do need subscribers to look at going over to Patreon and give me $1 a month, $5 a month, some amount, so the Spike can not have to go out and work at Macy's sticking labels on things again. So please give us some money. So there you are. There's my plea for the day. And today we're going to continue from our discussion of anatta, the doctrine of no self, which is the foundation of Buddhism, and talk about the 8 dynamics. Now, for anyone who has the good fortune not to be familiar with Scientology, Hubbard divided up the urges towards survival into what he called the 8 dynamics. And the first of these is the urge to exist as yourself. And Jeffrey sent me over a definition, do you want me to read this here?
No, I'd like to read it, John. I'll take.
All right, then you can read it then.
Okay. I have the con, as they say on a ship. That's kind of a word play.
Yep.
And when I say I have the con, you have to repeat back. You have the con.
You have the con. You are the con.
Okay, so basically in our last episode, we distinguished between the Buddhist doctrine of non-self, and that has to do with the idea of impermanence, consciousness, and most fundamentally in Buddhism, you're not a self. That's considered to be an illusion born of attachment, craving, desire, and those things are to be transcended. Yep. Okay. And I'm just going to, that's just sort of an ankle deep walk through Buddhism. We're not going to go into sophisticated scholastic Buddhism. Conversely, in Scientology, Hubbard made you irreducibly a self. You are only yourself. And here's something, John, I wanted to start at the beginning, and we'll circle back around to this. In Scientology, you are a thetan. That's Hubbard's word for spirit. But you're irreducibly a thetan. That's all you can ever be. And here's something to think about for lurking Scientologists who are watching. Hubbard's bridge to total freedom goes from basically grade 1 up to OT 15 as published right now. But Hubbard ends it at OT 8. And Hubbard's death allowed him to not have to finish it. So the end phenomena in Scientology, everything has an end phenomena. What there is to be realized from grade 1 or grade 2 are clear. OT 8, the realization is, I know who I am not. And I'm ready to find out.
I knew I wasn't Elvis already. It's like, sorry.
What I'm saying is that the realization at OT 8 is I know who I am not, and I am ready to find out who I am. Now, what that means, I know who I am not. I am not my reactive mind. I am not my body statements.
I'm not L. Ron Hubbard.
And I'm ready to find out who I am. Said another way, I don't know who I am, but I'm ready to find out. Well, the reason people get into Scientology is to handle personal problems and to find out who the hell they are. Who am I? That's why I'm going to go into Scientology. Scientology promises to give you self-knowledge, find out who you are. But yet, when you end at OT 8 at the top of the bridge after $1 million or more, you know who you're not. So it's a negative. It's, in fact, Hubbard said OT 8 was the first real case game. that everything else prior to OT was negative case gain. You weren't gaining anything. For new Scientology watchers, I'll give it to you this way. When you go to the doctor, you know he has a file on you. Let's check your medical case, right? Or if you've ever been in the hospital, let's check your case notes, right? Patient improving. Hubbard did the same thing. He borrowed from psychiatry and medicine by giving everybody a case. So what is your case? So when you go into Scientology, the first thing you get is you have a case. And this case needs to be handled. And the case needs to be handled with Scientology auditing and processing and all sorts of things, right?
Yep.
You pay for as you go. In Christianity, when you go to Christianity, you're given a sin nature. You have to accept the fact you have a sin nature that has to be handled. And some parts of your sin nature are not you, but they're caused by demonic entities.
Now you tell me.
Well, this is really just interesting. I'm playing with things here, but in Christianity, your sin nature is not you, right? That's not your redeemed self. You've died to the old man and risen to new life in Christ, right? But you're still beset by the sin nature. And then when it gets really bad, it's demonic oppression, could be demonic possession, right? So by analogy in Scientology, you have a case. And initially it's when you enter and do the grades through clear, you're dealing with your reactive mind. That's mental fixations, compulsions, all kinds of stuff that you audit out. And then when you go clear, you don't have your reactive mind, and then you go on to the OT levels. Just what's kind of interesting, they used to promote this heavily, John, they don't do it anymore. When you go clear and you don't have your reactive mind, L. Ron Hubbard said you were in great danger, and you have to be rushed up and gotten onto the OT levels as soon as possible.
In the non-interference area.
Yes, so between attesting clear, I'm clear, I don't have my reactive mind, which is a construct you never had anyway, you accepted that you did, nevertheless. Between clear and OT, there's the non-interference zone where Hubbard said you can't be processed on Dianetics. Because what you don't know when you attest clear, you don't know that you have body thetans and what's called a BT case. You don't know that yet. So any problems that happen after you go clear, you might think you still have engrams in a reactive mind and have to go backwards. We're saying, no, go this way to find out about the BTs on OT3. So this gets complicated, but the point is you're still a self. You are a self. You're not a Buddha. You're still fundamentally dealing with an identity. You're even lower than the self. You're saddled with an identity called a Scientologist who has a case that must be handled by the payment of monies to a corporate entity after the signature of contracts and security checks. So you're just so buried under layers and layers and layers of stuff. Now, going into the Scientology concept of self, Hubbard laid out 8 dynamics of life. He said life is a composite of 8 dynamics. The first dynamic is self. That's what he calls it. And I'm going to read right from the Scientology.org website. And I'm going to give the listeners the definition of what Scientology says the first dynamic is. So, quote, the first dynamic is self. This is the effort to survive as an individual, to be an individual. It includes one's own body and one's own mind. It is the effort to attain the highest level of survival for the longest possible time for self. This dynamic includes the individual plus his immediate possessions. It does not include other people. It is the urge to survive as oneself. Here we have individuality expressed fully, unquote. So, John, we're going to unpackage this and deconstruct it in our podcast here.
Yes.
Because it fascinated me.
Yeah.
So the first dynamic is self. Okay. This is the effort to survive as an individual, to be an individual. So that first sentence tells us, this first sentence, to survive as an individual, tells us Scientology is not Buddhism, it cannot be Buddhism.
Yeah.
It's the effort to survive as an individual, to be an individual.
To avoid Buddha mind and nirvana.
Yes. Well, basically, it's also all about me. My first dynamic is to survive about me because it says it does not include other people. So how can I survive? In Scientology, at its worst, is very much about me, me, me. What I want, my will, my postulates. How can I impose my will on others?
What is elsewhere called narcissism?
Yes, the Nietzschean will to power. I will impose my will on you. I will impose my postulates on the mass universe. I will get what I want. So it's very much a me religion. Me, mine, not yours, right?
Me, mine.
And yes, me, mine. Now, it also says it includes one's own body and one's own mind. Now, in Buddhism, the doctrine of impermanence states that nothing is permanent. And we know that from the laws of entropy, the loss of energy. Biological life is a disequilibrium state. And so you're always exerting energy to maintain life, right?
Homeostasis.
Yes. So in Scientology, the definition of self includes one's own body and one's own mind. Now, what's interesting is L. Ron Hubbard really denigrated the body as a meat body, a meat sack. He's very denigrating about the body. And that's why when Scientologists die, they say, oh, they dropped the body, as if we're dropping a paperweight and the spirit
Putting
moves
something
on.
in the garbage, the trash.
Yeah, he dropped his body. There's not a sacredness about death at all. It's not. There was a registrar here, I won't use her name, out of French. It was someone I know, it was their mother. She was in the Sea Org and she died at her desk. She wasn't being treated for medical illness. And she literally died at her desk in the Sea Org here in Los Angeles. And she was commended for staying on post until the end. Like, what the hell is that about? You literally work someone to death, don't get her medical care. When she dies at her desk, move the body, put a new body in place to take her post and give her a commendation for staying on post till she dropped the body. John, that's just so evil. It shows you the disposability of Sea Org members as coins, as they call them, coins to be traded. So if a Sea Org member dies at post, you get the body out of there because it's out PR for an org to have a dead body of a Sea Org member. And then you get someone trained or hatted to take their place so that statistics don't drop. So that's not a first dynamic. That's what we call slavery.
No. Without doubt.
This is important. The Sea Org does not have a first dynamic. As a Sea Org member, you do not have a first dynamic. We'll get to another interview, the third dynamic, the group. You're the group and you don't have a first dynamic.
It's one of the conflicts that's fundamental to Scientology, that you are promised from the beginning that through Scientology you will become self-determined. But when somebody joins the Sea organization, they sign a contract which includes the code of a Sea organization member, in which one promises to follow and uphold command intention for the next 1,000 million years. And so you're signing a contract where you're giving away your first dynamic, your self-determination, to command intention, which is to say, to Ron Hubbard and now to David Miscavige. So the conflict, and I've often said that the double bind is how Scientology works, that it just presents you with the opposites again and again and again. And as Hubbard said, when you're presented with opposites, you'll become so confused that you don't know what to do and you'll just follow orders. So the whole idea of becoming self-determined, thinking for yourself, becomes agreeing completely and complying with the orders, the commands of Ron Hubbard. or David Miscavige now.
Yeah, that's very important. You can't have, if you're told, the minute you join any religion, the search for truth ends and the defense of the identity begins.
Yep.
That's true in any religion. So when you become a Scientologist, you don't know, you're given an identity. You're not self-determined. You must be a Scientologist in good standing. When you join the Sea Org, you give up your first dynamic, your right to be self-determined, and that goes out the window. So you're going to be a group member, a coin who can die at your desk and be exited, and at county expense normally.
Yes.
Point.
And this, county expense from a group that has billions of dollars in investments, and they're, as mean as can be in their treatment of their own.
Oh.
The lack of compassion is absolutely staggering.
It's unbelievably sadistic. Now, the second part, let's parse this. So, quote, Scientology says of this first dynamic, quote, "It is the effort to attain the highest level of survival for the longest possible time for self," unquote. Now, if you read this, it makes it sound like they want you to have the highest quality of life and longevity, the highest level of survival, which means the most havingness or money or cash possessions, right? For the longest possible time for self. That means longevity with flourishing and prospering, as they put it. That's the ideal, but is that the reality?
Far from it.
Maybe for a few ultra wealthy Scientologists, but even then, they don't have a true first dynamic because they have to write knowledge reports. And what I wanted to get into at this point, let me interject a comment. The American president, one of my favorites, Harry Truman, he went through he was probably one of the most financially poor presidents in American history. He didn't have a lot of money in his life.
Didn't even have a proper second name. He just had the initial S.
Correct, Harry S. Truman.
Incredible.
And well, he was. I believe he was the last American president to have pulled a plow, pulled by horses.
Worked for a living.
He plowed fields, and good Kansas man. He also worked as a haberdasher, a clothing store, and he went broke. And he worked to pay off that debt, and he was poor. He became a senator, well known. He ran as Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president. He suddenly talked about having to be a decider. He had to decide to drop the atom bombs. He had to decide to do that instead of invade Japan. He had to decide to do a lot of things, right?
Yeah, I mean, just one little footnote, and I know it's pedantic of me, but there's a War Cabinet memo where Truman says that the reason they need to drop the atom bomb is to show the Russians. And what so many people don't understand in the West is that there were 1.5 million Russian troops who were just on their way into Manchuria. And so there were two pressures upon the Japanese. And the idea coming perhaps from Churchill was to frighten the Russians in some way. It didn't work. It went terribly wrong. But
yes, it did. And that's a very notable. The reason I mentioned Harry Truman is after he left office, okay, some of his friends purchased him a home, and he was able to pay for another home for his sisters.
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting. He had never owned a home. He actually owned a home, and he told his sister, "You own a home now, free and clear. So enjoy it and live life for as long as you can."
Yeah.
And being free of the burden of a mortgage he urged her to live for as long as she could, to enjoy having a house that was paid for. That's the simplicity of Harry S. Truman. For him, after the presidency and everything he did, doing ending World War II on the Allied side, along with Winston Churchill and other leaders. For him, the simplicity was to own a house that was free and clear.
Yeah.
And to me, that really struck me. In Scientology's modern definition, the first dynamic, it is the effort to attain the highest level of survival. And if you know Scientology cult talk, the highest level of survival means to have as much money as you possibly can.
Yep.
Because Scientology, the true God is money. They don't have a monotheistic God. They don't have a God they worship or pray to. The God is the ninth dynamic, as Hubbard called it, money. So you get the most.
There's a simple differentiation between Scientology and Christianity here, in that Christ said that you could worship God or mammon, meaning money. Those are the choices. You can worship material things or you can worship God. So to be a Christian, now, of course, we now have the prosperity Christians and all the confusion they create. But to be a Christian and to be a Scientologist is fundamentally incompatible for many reasons. That's one of them.
Well, sure. Jesus said, what does it profit a person if they gain the entire world but lose their own soul? Which means when you throw away your values, integrity, and you become a crook to gain money, what have you done?
Or to gain money at all. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And there may be some people out there who think that that's why Hubbard and Miscavige just stripped all the money from their followers, so they'll be able to go to heaven in true poverty.
Yeah, that's in a word that's simple. They just want the money.
Yeah, sadly so.
But the point here is a couple. Scientology is very materialistic. So the first dynamic is fundamentally materialism. And this is what I suggest when Scientologists think of themselves as spiritual. They're not. They're materialistic. They're money-grubbing, materialistic, greedy. And Scientology condones white-collar criminality. We've seen that David Gentili's $1.8 billion Ponzi scheme for which he's facing criminal trial. The Spina brothers' $80 million Medicare fraud. Dr. Dennis Nobby's PPP loan fraud. In fact, the late Dr. Dennis Nobby, he was told his bail was revoked and he was going to jail and he dropped dead of a heart attack. So on this definition that Scientology is saying that you want to live for the longest possible time, is that true, John? Do Scientologists, are they really committed to longevity? I say no.
Well, we can start with Ron Hubbard, who made the claim that Scientology will give you a longer life. He died at the age of 74. His father died at the age of 91. So he didn't take good care of his own body. His teeth rotted in his head. He had a great big sebaceous cyst on his head, which you can see in photographs taken in Queens, New York by Jim Dinkelsey, 1973. He abused drugs, he abused alcohol. It's said by Jesse Prince at the end of his life, when he was receiving medical treatment, that he was an alcoholic. So he didn't live a long time. He didn't look after his body, his matter, energy, space, and time, his messed body. We then go on to look at the life expectancy of Scientologists. One of the things that I did back in 1993, when I was the president of FactNet, briefly for about a year, Lawrence Wollersheim said to me, what's the suicide rate in Scientology? And I went off and I looked into, I think it was 38 cases. And by looking at the actual membership of Scientology, not the millions that are claimed, but the real figures in the tens of thousands, I figured out at that time that the suicide rate in Scientology was probably about 10 times what it is in the United States or the United Kingdom. And it was interesting to find that among those cases were a number of people who worked closely with Ron Hubbard, who knew Hubbard. and had been promised all sorts of things by Hubbard. And the one thing you have to say about Scientology is it promises everything and delivers nothing. There is no leukemia, cancer, asthma, cures for these, have not been found. When Helen O'Brien, the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists, put a goldfish bowl on the counter in the Philadelphia organization where the doctorate course was delivered, they put it there so people could put their eyeglasses in it. As they threw them away as their eyesight recovered, a claim made by Hubbard in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, and perpetuated thereafter. Hubbard never threw his glasses away, and Helen O'Brien said the bowl stayed empty. Nobody did this. So you have all of these claims. So the claim to length of life, no, I think probably Scientologists on average have a shorter lifespan than the society in which that is normal in the society in which they live.
This is interesting, and it's something that Scientology itself will never do a study on. So,
although it claims to be scientific,
yeah,
there's only been one study in Scientology, and that was the Los Angeles study of the engram, where they found, and they published this. I have the publication from 1951. They found that they could not recover an engram. And Hubbard talks about using pain drug hypnosis in the book Science of Survival. That's what he's talking about. And that's the only attempt at science that I'm aware of in the whole history of Scientology. And I've spent far too much time studying the history of Scientology. Hubbard was the least scientific of human beings.
Likewise, but I haven't wasted as much time as you. But your book is so extraordinary. I'm glad you did devote that time.
Thank you.
Interestingly, Hubbard in the early 1950s, when he was being challenged with Dianetics, he was floating in money, but he was stealing it as fast as it came in.
Yep. Bankrupted all 5 of the first foundations personally, needed no help.
Well, here was Hubbard's solution. He said, we welcome your assistance into funding research on Scientology. So he turned it around instead of like, we'll pay for it. No, you can pay for it to see if it's true. I'm sorry, Dr. Hubbard, the burden's on you to finance this stuff.
Modern science of mental health.
And even if the American Psychiatric Association said, okay, we'll fund it, he would have found a reason not to go into the study.
There was a study. There was a study at Chicago University which found that it didn't work.
Yes. Well, we'll ignore that, Dr. Hubbard said. He's walking and then it goes, John, let me divert and tell you an interesting story from my Christian youth. I was, I went to Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa with Papa Chuck Smith at Jesus People Revival, that era. Mm. But I also went to Melody Land Christian Center in Anaheim. My father liked to go there. Yeah. And, Hal Lindsey, author of The Late Great Planet Earth, would speak. Dr. Walter Martin, the Bible Answer Man, a lot of the Mario Murillo, Kenneth Copeland, a lot of the greats, would speak there at the time, right? So I would volunteer because I was a nice young Christian boy. So this couple, the Hunters, their ministry was delivering people from the demon of cigarette smoking. Mm. So I volunteered to help. I was even a catcher at faith healing rallies, where you catch people when they were slain in the spirit.
Excellent.
And look, listen, there's things to be learned about how to properly catch people. If you got a big, heavy guy, you're going to need 2 people. Have to wear a sport coat, because if a woman, is slain in the spirit and falls backwards, you have to be very delicate about catching her, so you don't anywhere near the breasts, right?
God, this is useful information, Jeffrey.
Well, no, I'm serious. It's like you gotta Plus, when you catch a woman, you have to pivot her away from the audience, cover her legs because she's wearing a skirt, because women don't wear clothes to church. You cover her legs with your sport coat so that you preserve modesty.
Okay.
So there's like whole classes on how to work with the faith healer. And it's pretty intense on stage when people are boom, boom, like Benny Hinn just laying down people and you're catching. It's pretty intense. It's psychodrama, but man, you're like seeing all kinds of you're seeing all kinds of amazing things. People just, I mean, the intensity is enormous. Some people fall down when they get slain in the spirits. They just want to go along with it. You know, they don't want to like sit there and, you know, but when the healers, some people just go out like they've been hit with lightning. So anyway, the hunters, I was working a rally, and the hunters, Melody Land was a theater in the round, right? And so you would go up from all directions. So the happy hunters, they were called, they were doing, delivering you from the demon of nicotine. So people were coming up to the altar at the end, and they were throwing down their packs of cigarettes and their Zippo lighters and their matches. And we were there gathering them up in trash bags, you know? And it was a lot of people smoked back then.
Oh.
So yeah. I remember a couple faces, you know, and one guy looked at me and he like, kind of like, I am free of the demon of nicotine. And I threw his cigarettes down. And so we stayed after service was over, because there's things to do after service is over, right?
Well, there's cigarettes to sell for one thing, you know.
Well, no, you're close, but Pastor Wilkerson, you know, come back, say thank you for your serving, and the hunters would talk to us, and then you kind of clean up, and then we were out back. So a couple of us went out back to the dumpsters to dump out all the cigarettes, and they're like, so word had gotten around the homeless community there in Anaheim, people along Harbor Boulevard, and they were there to like score.
Yeah.
And one of them, a big fellow, just basically told me to hand over the bag. Like, you know, like, I'm not going to argue over cigarettes here. They're yours.
Yeah.
He disappeared. And all those beautiful Zippo lighters that I'd known, I would have kept those and sold them on Amazon.
Oh, well.
But who knew? So anyway, it's like, I'm in midnight, 12:30, I get done. And I go to the 7-Eleven to get something to eat, you know, because I hadn't eaten. I see if one of the fellows in there, and he's kind of looking away from me, sheepishly buying cigarettes. And it was one of the guys who had given up his cigarettes at the altar at Milligan Christian Center. So his deliverance from cigarettes lasted a couple hours. And then the demon got him again.
That demon. Oh.
So these cures in the faith often last no more than hours or moments. They're very ephemeral, you know. But anyway, that was an amusing story. Shifting back to Scientology, so you said nobody was putting their eyeglasses into the fish bowl because you need glasses to see, and that's just, you know, I just got my prescription upgraded for my glasses, you know, because every couple of years you need a new prescription. So I wanted to go back. We're talking about Scientologists in lifespan. And one thing that's anecdotal is there seems to be a lot more Scientologists dying of cancer than the normal population rate.
Yeah,
we don't have.
I did some work on this with my friend Steve Bisbee, who remained a practitioner of Scientology, but we were good friends, and it was some time before the independents decided they disliked me as much as, you know, the mother cult dislikes me. I used to help them, protect them in their litigation and things like that back in the 80s. And very early on, probably the end of 83, Steve came to me and he said that there are far too many OTs dying of cancer. Yeah. Is it something that's wrong with the OT materials? That was the first thought. And I was coming towards the end of my believing at this time, but I still kind of believed. And I started looking at particular cases. It started with a lovely woman called Christine Haas, who's this very jolly German woman who used to make some kind of living baking bread and selling it to people. And she got cancer. She was basically moved away so that nobody would see her. And I ended up talking to a woman who had actually been assigned by Scientology to baby watch her, to use Scientology's term. And she ended her life, in fact, in a Buddhist monastery where she was given care. And Scientology had completely ostracized her by this time. The story I usually tell about this is Brown McKee's story. And he testified at the Clearwater hearings in 1982 in Florida, which you can probably find online somewhere. And I read the transcripts of it. And he said that, he and his wife, I think he was involved for 24 years, he said. So from 1957, I think. And he was a physicist, and he was fascinated by the Buddhist ideas in Scientology. I've said before that made me laugh because he knew that the physics was nonsense, but he thought the Buddhism was fascinating. I knew that Buddhism was nonsense, but I thought the physics was fascinating. So the scientific angle. But he said that his wife developed cancer, and they went to Florida to see what help could be offered, and were told that Scientology could do nothing about this. And they were given the address of a clinic in Mexico. And when they arrived there, the waiting room was full, he said, of Scientology OTs, people who had progressed to the high levels of Scientology and developed cancer. Now, I looked into a fair amount of cases, and I came away with the conclusion that it wasn't something to do with body fate and hunting. It was simply because these people were not receiving medical care rapidly enough, that they were hoping for a Scientological cure. And with cancer, you have to act quickly.
Yeah, I agree with you. They put off medical care in hopes that auditing or other quack cures, holistic cures. I want to go through a list so they put it off, and suddenly they're stage 4.
Yeah,
terminal, and it's irreversible because they've lost all that valuable time initially on first diagnosis.
Yes,
so important. Breast cancer, lung cancer, any kind of cancer, you want to get right on it. You don't want to hope that auditing or a faith healer, Benny Hinn, or anything. This is just science. Get it handled no matter what faith tradition you're in.
Yeah, wishing, hoping, praying, and dreaming are not actually going to solve it. And the faster you go, the more likely.
I want to go through a list of prominent Scientologists who have died of cancer. And this is very interesting. Mary Sue Hubbard died of cancer. She was a smoker.
And she was the Deputy Commodore of Scientology and the controller of the Guardian's office, and the wife of Ron Hubbard, and the mother of four of his children.
Yeah, so Ron Hubbard died of a stroke at 74, and his wife, who could have the best auditing in the world, died of cancer from smoking. Dr. Jean Denk, Ron Hubbard's personal physician, died of cancer. Henning Helt, Guardian's office, Snow White operative who went to prison, died of cancer. Ingrid Keller, OT, class 9, died of cancer. Recently, OT, operating Thetan Chick Korea, international jazz music legend, died of cancer. OT, Kelly Preston, wife of John Travolta, died of cancer. Clark Carr, president of Narconon, died of cancer. Dr. Megan Shields, who was a very prominent proponent of Narconon and a holistic medical practitioner, died of cancer. Annie Tidman, CMO, Commodore's Messenger Organization, Hubbard's caretaker at the ranch when he died of cancer. I can go down some names from They Should Not Have Died. Mark Carberry, Dorothy Barden, Ellie Blankenship, Bevan Priest, Pat Bloomberg, Gabriela Bramucci, David Butterworth, who was OSA, Jerome de Bruyne, Enid Byrne, who was a registrar at AOLA, Alice Miller, Sally Cheloff, Mindy Duncanson, Natalie Ellis, Betty Feliski, Samia Gallup, Mary Garlick, Chuck Lemmer, Ann Timpian, Ruth Falco Burness, died of cancer, and there's a lot more. I'm just going down the list of prominent people.
Yeah.
Well, Kelly Preston died of cancer at she was 54, I believe. And her son Jet Travolta died young. He was struggling with autism, and I want to get into that. The second thing I want to get into, because again, Scientology is saying in their definition of the first dynamic, it is the effort to attain the highest level of survival for the longest time possible for self. This gets us into suicides. Far too many Scientologists commit suicide. I'm going to go through a list real quickly and please add to it. Steve Brackett was an OT. He at one time was Nancy Cartwright's fiance. She's the voice of Bart Simpson and a Scientologist. Steve Brackett jumped to his death from the bridge up in Big Sur, California. He had gone bankrupt. He was in severe financial trouble and he killed himself. But jumping from a bridge was highly symbolic. That almost seemed like an FU to Scientology.
Yeah.
Philip Gale, a brilliant young man. This is a tragic story. Philip Gale, Gale, 1998. He was a brilliant student at MIT. He jumped to his death. That's a story worth reading. It's heartbreaking. Another odd death in 2014, Yevgeny Zarkin, a Russian, he somehow fell to his death from a building at Flag. You don't accidentally fall off a building. That was a suicide, clearly. You don't go up on the edge of a building and fall off. I don't know anyone that's ever happened to. Oops, I didn't mean to fall off. He wasn't up there with his GoPro. In Latin America, there was a very prominent diet doctor, diet, health, exercise doctor, an OT Scientologist named Frank Suarez. And he jumped to his death last year from, I believe, the 9th story balcony of his condo in San Juan, Puerto Rico. That shocked a lot of Latin America. He had a big following of people who were not Scientologists. He wrote a lot of books, and he jumped to his death, which was very strange because he apparently had everything to live for. He had a nice place, a good reputation, a large audience, affluence. He was an OT, and he jumped to his death. Why? Here locally, actor Johnny Lewis, who had starred in Sons of Anarchy, he grew up in Scientology. His parents were Scientologists. He murdered his 81-year-old landlady, killed her cat, mutilated it, and then he either jumped or fell to his death. From the house was up on a hill and there was a garage, so we don't know whether he walked off it or jumped off it. Johnny Lewis, promising acting career, his OT parents could not help him. OT Rex Fowler in Colorado, he shot and killed his business partner in cold blood. They had quite a fight over Rex Fowler taking money out of the company and donating it to Scientology and not paying his partner, running the software company into bankruptcy. He engaged in the premeditated murder of his business partner, called him to the office a morning and shot and killed him at point blank range with a Glock. It was registered address, L. Ron Hubbard, his son in L. Ron Hubbard Way here in LA. Rex put the gun to his face, his hand wavered, he shot, the bullet traversed his sinuses, exited his forehead. So he tried to kill himself, but it wasn't successful. He's now life in prison, first-degree murder. Those are some of the suicides, and there's a lot more. There was an OT who died at Flag, scalded to death in the bathtub.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, the strange deaths, suicides in Scientology are legion.
Well, let me just quickly add a few names. Lee Johnson, who was the mother of a 2-year-old in East Grinstead. James Stewart, who was the head of the Durban organization, who jumped to his death in 1968 while doing OT3 in Edinburgh. Susan Meister, and I had some dealings with her father. I talked with her father, who was convinced that she couldn't have killed herself. He was a weapons expert and said that the weapon used had too long a barrel, but nonetheless, she's listed as...
He was found dead on the flagship Apollo.
That's correct. And Ron Hubbard refused to see George Meister when he flew all the way to Morocco to just to ask what had happened. And her body was returned in a lead casket to the US with a statement, I believe, that she had cholera or something, so the casket could never be opened. Truly dreadful. John Neugebauer, who was Helen O'Brien's partner, she was the deputy of running Scientology at the time, and Noah Lottick, Ed Lottick, the Dr. Ed Lottick's son. Just to add 5 more to show, and that's without going and looking at any lists. Those are just at the top of my mind. That there have been a fair amount more. And
I want to, for the end of the list, I want to leave most notably Quentin Hubbard.
Absolutely, yes.
L. Ron Hubbard's own son committed suicide. Some people believe he may have been murdered.
I don't think that there's any proof of that, having looked into that case and talked to people, and
likewise, I've read the evidence. It seemed pretty evident that Quentin killed himself. Yeah,
and it's important to say that Quentin Hubbard, as a young boy, Hubbard issued a policy letter saying that Quentin would be his heir. He would succeed him as the head of Scientology. Quentin, of course, went all the way through the Scientology bridge as it was. He was one of the 50 people who achieved the Class 12 auditor status. Only 50 people have ever done that. And he was an OT7 on the old grade chart. And in fact, all of his certificates were cancelled, and off he went, having been told that he got to redo everything. And the people I've spoken to who knew him say that he was not an intellectual, let's put it that way. He was a simple and straightforward man. He was homosexual, which was not acceptable to his father, or it was not acceptable to be publicly known, because there is evidence that Hubbard himself practiced homosexuality, certainly as a teenager, from his own letters. But he publicly was homophobic. And the Quentin, the thing that's come back to me from the various people I've known who knew him, is that he was a really gentle and sweet human being. He was incredibly unlike his parents.
Well, I mean, him being, I've heard nothing but good things about Quentin from people who knew him.
Yeah.
Him being so gentle spirit, he only wanted to fly airplanes.
Yeah, that's what he wanted to do.
Him being a very good, considerate, kind man, young man, would make him completely unsuitable for leadership at the top of Scientology, where viciousness, sadism, brutality, lies, cruelty, greed are requisite.
Yeah, you can't run an authoritarian cult if you've got a heart.
No, the worst of the worst rise to the top in Scientology. So moving on, the first dynamic. So there has been suicides, deaths from cancer, but not just cancer. There has been leukemia, all kinds of preventable deaths. And one thing I would add, we've talked about before, Scientologists smoke cigarettes. Not all of them, but many of them do smoke or vape.
Yeah, we're down to, in the population in the UK, about 20% of people smoke. I would think probably about 70% of Scientologists smoke, even though Hubbard said it was because they were frightened of volcanoes. He himself, of course, was 100 cigarettes a day man, and would say to his messengers that he wished he could stop smoking. And this is the man who's the founder of the drug rehabilitation group Narconon, but he couldn't stop drinking.
Well, it's physician heal thyself. Narconon did L. Ron Hubbard absolutely zero good. He did not purify him. He didn't practice it. And David Miscavige still smokes, to my knowledge.
And they're both asthmatics as well. So talk about self-harm.
Yeah, no, going back to, so we can finish up first dynamic, Scientology says, quote, this dynamic includes the individual plus his immediate possessions, unquote. If you're a spiritual being, why are you identified with your possessions? Look, I'm not anti-materialistic, okay? But I'm not, I don't live for my possessions. I don't identify myself with my possessions. I think because we do grow older, it's important to save the nest egg, for retirement. Because
I went wrong there. Darn.
Well, I mean, I'm going to be working until the day I die. I like to work. And as long as I can work, I like to work. I enjoy working. I like being busy. I see work as a joy. Not always, but most of the time I like to create, I like to work, I like to do things. I can make a living thinking, analyzing. I used to travel a lot. I don't like to travel anymore. All I'm saying is Scientology strips you of your ability, unless you're ultra wealthy, to have any kind of savings for your old age. And one of my suspicions, John, is that people who wind up old and broke in Scientology will kill themselves or not get medical treatment. They don't have the money or they don't have insurance.
They'll drop the body.
Well, if you're in your 70s, early 70s, and you're sick and you don't have any money and your whole future is to be broke and you never got Social Security because you were self-employed or Sea Org, you might kill yourself. You might drink yourself to death. You might decide life is not worth living. So the economic pressures of life, maybe living in an apartment, falling behind your rent, being evicted, it's miserable. It's really miserable.
And there's no retirement plan for this organization. I have known a number of people who got into their 70s, were no longer considered useful, and were thrown out on the street. And that was with one woman I know of who spent at least 30 years in this organization. When she was too old, they threw her out and then preyed upon her and said, although you've done all of the OT levels, you will still be caught when you die in the between lives area, and you will be implanted, and none of it will have done you any good. You have to do superpower. And she borrowed, I was told, £35,000 to buy the new set of books, the new tapes, all of the stuff she'd need. And her only way of repaying this was through her state pension. So she had no money for rent, no money for food. And thankfully, one of her daughters, who was no longer involved with Scientology, said, I'm going to tell the media about you if you don't give her her money back. But what an incredible situation. And when she died, her children who were no longer in, those of her children who were no longer in Scientology, were asked not to go to the funeral so as not to upset the Scientologists who were going to the funeral. The lack of care for other people. Another thing about this dropping the body thing, I've had a few people who've come to me and they've said that when one of their parents died, they didn't grieve because they just dropped the body. And 10 years later, when they left Scientology, all of this grief welled up. The disrespect that they had shown to their own parents by not grieving about them.
Absolutely. And because I'll tell a story, and I'm not going to give names. I'll let the person who had experience with it. David Miscavige's wife, Shelley Miscavige, who's often viewed as a sympathetic figure, has a reputation among those who know her. She could be very vicious. Very vicious. Her mother killed herself. Flo Barnett killed herself.
Yep.
That was a strange suicide because it was a long rifle, 3 shots to the chest. And in studying suicides, there are often, it was a .22 caliber, so it's not, it can kill you, but multiple gunshot wound suicides are uncommon, but they do happen.
Okay, yeah.
Especially among soldiers, sadly, who have PTSD, they'll put a bullet into themselves and it doesn't work and they have to do another one. So lower caliber multi-gunshot, but Shelley Miscavige's mother, Flo Barnett, killed herself. You can Google it. She had left the church and joined David Mayo's group. And she was declared. Someone said to Shelley, I'm sorry to hear about your mom. And Shelley said, F the bitch. That's what she said about her own mother. And we'll leave that there. So this first dynamic, Scientology says, quote, it does not include other people, unquote. And so because the first dynamic does not include other people, it does not include a consideration for other people. You will write knowledge reports on your own wife, your own children. Your own children will write knowledge reports on you. It does not include other people. So the phrase does not include other people means it's all me. It's all about me. And when a definition of life does not include other people, then by definition, it becomes hostile to others. It becomes narcissistic. It even becomes solipsistic.
Yes.
It's my reality, my universe. In Scientology, you often hear, that's not in my universe. Oh, you have a universe? Yeah, it's their own universe. Yeah, it's not. And then, it's not in my universe. And that's always a strange thing because we are in the universe. We don't have our own universe. Now, you can call your own subjectivity a universe if you want. That's just semantics. My own subjectivity is not universal.
No.
It doesn't. My own subjectivity is my own subjectivity. What's going on between, up here. It's not, I can call it a universe if I want, but anyway, Scientology will often say, stop, I can't think with the data. I can't think with that data. What do you mean you can't think? It means you don't want to. It's a refusal to deal with inconvenient facts. Like when, I've had a few, and I try to avoid talking to Scientologists. I don't anymore because I'm a known SP with a blog called the Scientology Money Project that is deemed quite suppressive by David Miscavige and the church. And it's interesting because it does get read. So I've talked to a few in the past when I was talking to Scientologists. They would say, I can't think with that data. I don't want to hear black propaganda. I don't want to hear theta. So when it doesn't include other people, it should be expanded to say it does not include the possibility of listening to contrary points of view. Hubbard claimed that a Scientologist should be able to experience anything. And yet, increasingly, Scientologists can experience nothing. They're not willing to experience their own feelings. They're not willing to let in outside knowledge. Kirstie Alley last week on Twitter said she didn't know if Putin's invasion of Ukraine was real. And I'm sorry, and you can blurt this out, but I gotta say, what the is wrong with you, Kirstie Alley? You believe in Xenu and BTs are quite real, but you don't know if Putin's invasion of Ukraine was real? She was slammed on Twitter, and rightfully so. If you're that devoid of understanding of reality and what's happening because you're first dynamic in your universe and you don't know if it's real, that was such, John, that was an outrage for her to do that. That showed her inability to take in the real world as it is. For her to say she didn't know if this invasion was real. What is wrong with her? What's missing from her understanding?
You have the basic dictum in Scientology, what's true for you is true, which, as you and I both know, is a misrepresentation of the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha makes a very sensible statement about not believing things until you've proved them, not believing them because your parents told you, a spirit whispered in your ear, or even because the Buddha said it to you. You should check things and test them. That doesn't add up to what's true for you is true, because that's the way of saying, I don't have to believe things if I don't want to. And that's a way of saying, I don't believe I have cancer, so therefore I'm not going to see a doctor. It is not rational. It's not rational.
See, this is where a good skeptical attitude of well, let me check into that for myself. I'll tell you something, as a private investigator, I don't assume anything. A client can tell me something and the client may be lying to me.
Yeah.
May not be telling me facts. As an investigator, you have, and in life in general, to be skeptical means to listen and I had an encounter with someone who was very much in QAnon, right? But they had some very important information that was correct that I needed. So I mentally deducted out the QAnon part of it, okay? I took the valuable, actual, verifiable information that I was able to verify. So I can separate a person's political beliefs because some part of what they're saying is accurate, right? But in general, that attitude of skeptical inquiry, of checking into it for yourself is important. Kirstie Alley could have easily ascertained that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was very real, with very little effort on her part. I don't know if the horror and the atrocity of the invasion overwhelmed her and she couldn't confront it. I don't know. I can't speak for her. Only she could answer, and she wasn't willing to, but she got quite nasty after she was very publicly rebuked and called out for this. I found it to be appalling as a comment on her first dynamic. So finishing out Scientology's first dynamic, it does not include other people. Quote, it is the urge to survive as one's self. Okay, unquote. It is the urge to survive as oneself. Well, the urge to survive is innate. You don't need L. Ron Hubbard to tell you that survival drives us, the urge to survive. That's what the Ukrainians are doing now. They're trying to survive, and they're fighting heroically under President Zelensky. You don't need Hubbard to tell you that the urge to survive is innate. And that's one thing I really resent about Hubbard, things that are innate. He acted like nobody ever knew about it before him.
Oh, yeah. He was the first person to discover the spirit, the human spirit.
Yeah, no, he said it was, he either said he discovered the spirit or it was the rediscovery of the spirit, like it had gotten lost.
Where did you last have it?
Yeah, we go back almost 10,000 years with the idea of spirit. So, and then finally, Scientology ends with, quote, here we have individuality expressed fully, unquote. I'm sorry, but the last thing you're allowed to express in the Church of Scientology is individuality. You may not express it unless it conforms to the accepted realities of Scientology. You cannot express individuality fully. You get sect checked because we want to make sure you're not harboring any suppressive thoughts or actions, right? Well, if you have to get sect checked, you can't fully express your individuality. You can only confess your crimes. So how does the full expression of individuality, it's contradictory to be in an atmosphere of sect checking, being security checked constantly for your crimes, or not being allowed to think. You have to engage in thought stopping to be a Scientologist. Therefore, you're not fully expressing your individuality. The fact that you might be an OSA volunteer, you might lie, cheat, steal, break the law for the Office of Special Affairs because you think it's for the highest good. Breaking the law is not expressing individuality, it's breaking the law. And so this whole idea that you're able to express yourself, Scientologists, you see them on Scientology TV saying, I finally was able to be fully me. And that's because they paid a couple $100,000 to go clear and they're fully them. No, they're another determined. L. Ron Hubbard told them what they are.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally an evaluation.
Yeah, and when we look at that notion of security checking for your crimes, when you look at the lists that are given for security checking, then a lot of these ideas are, do you have any thoughts that are in disagreement with Ron Hubbard? And so, and if we see the reinterpretation that he makes of the term antisocial personality, psychiatric term, diagnosis, antisocial personality, if you disagree with Ron Hubbard, you are an anti-Scientologist. Therefore, you are an antisocial personality. And so everything is pulled into this simple way of looking at the world. In Science of Survival, the second book attributed to Ron Hubbard, but actually written by Richard DeMille, we have at the end a little piece taken from Count Alfred Korzybski with no attribution. At the beginning of the book, he is named as one of the sources for what was then Dianetics. And it has the evaluation of data. And we have different forms of logic. And there is single-valued logic, which is the will of God. Then there's dual-valued logic, which is good or evil. And we then see the evaluation of a graduated scale of logic, which is put forward as the proper way to assess information. I was very impressed with that. It was the very first thing I saw, Science Survival. It's what attracted me to joining Scientology. If somebody had given me history of man, I'd never have got involved. But to me, I don't know any other place where that's talked about. And all you have is single-valued logic, which is the will of Ron Hubbard. And if you disagree with that, and it's hard not to disagree with it because he keeps contradicting himself. You know, he never looks back at anything he said in the past and then orders you that even if he does contradict himself, you've got to believe both things. You can't say the more recent thing is true.
Yeah. And going back, John, to an interesting thing about the suppressive personality, the antisocial personality. You and I would be considered by Scientology to be suppressive persons.
I have a little certificate that says I'm one.
I was never in long enough to get one. But,
unlucky.
But the point is,
next lifetime.
You and I are not allowed to have a first dynamic, according to Scientology. We're merely classified as suppressive persons.
We're to be destroyed.
Who should be destroyed. Yeah. So what about my first dynamic? What about my expression of individuality? Well, suppressive persons are not allowed to have that. We're just targets for destruction. So to Scientology, the whole concept of a first dynamic only applies to a Scientologist, right? And it's all about them and their obsequious acquiescence, their fearful acquiescence to David Miscavige. Just their pure cowardly acquiescence to David Miscavige and Scientology. Capitulation to totalitarianism. This capitulation to totalitarianism, this acquiescence to evil, could account for why Kirstie Alley doesn't know if Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine is real. She's so used to acquiescing to evil of her own church that it might have caused her some cognitive dissonance. So I don't know her mindset, but I do know that that we're targets for Scientology. Leah, Mike, you, Tony Ortega, go down the list, Aaron, everyone, we're targets. Those of us who speak out, yep. We're not allowed a first dynamic. Huh. So there's no freedom of speech. We're supposed to be silenced, but we fight, right? And we speak out. So this deconstruction we've done today of Scientology's first dynamic, you see there is no real true first dynamic. There is no real freedom to be yourself in Scientology. There's this artifice where you know that you don't have BTs and you've reached a state of clear, but those are constructions. They're artifice. And they can be revoked if you become a suppressive. All your certificates are revoked. So you lose your state of clear, you lose your OT.
And
so
they don't give you the money back.
No, and these states are really granted to you by the Religious Technology Center on a conditional basis. So even your state of clear or OT are just strictly conditional and conditioned upon your obedience, your continued acquiescence to evil of this organization, and your continued donations of money, so that when you're old and broke, you don't have anything. And that's why I always say the end phenomena of Scientology is nothing left of a person. They take it all down to the bone marrow. They suck it out. So in reviewing the first dynamic, I think it's important this was a good podcast about what the first dynamic is and why it's a lie and why it's not true. And that's my summary as we conclude.
Excellent. And it's worth pointing out one of the other contradictions in Scientology is the first axiom of Scientology, that life is basically a static. It has no mass, no motion, no location in space or in time, which is to say, the thetan, the self, the first dynamic, is nothing. Nothing. And in the lectures which were compiled into the book 8.8008, Hubbard explains that this is infinity gained by the individual by reducing the infinity of the physical universe to nothing and taking the nothing that is the individual to infinity. And this is semiotics. This is a completely meaningless statement until you sort of put it in that context, that the reality of Scientology is you will be cloned. You will be, in Hubbard's own words, processed and indoctrinated until such time as you become exactly the same as all of the other pieces. And finally, in the Philadelphia Doctorate course, I think the most important statement Hubbard is made, so I'm going to repeat it again, which is where he says that to have a game, the players must keep the rules from the pieces, the real rules, the true rules, because otherwise the pieces will start wanting to play. And I would say that the pieces of the Scientologists, the player is David Miscavige. He knows what the rules are. He knows what's really going on and where the money's coming from, and that people really are not benefiting from Scientology. To make something persist, you must enter a lie into it, as Aaron Hubbard said. So there is no benefit in Scientology, ultimately. The other point is, and Hubbard explains this in the lecture, that there is also the maker of the game maker, who does not have to follow the rules. And we found that with Ron Hubbard in spades, you might say. You know, he absolutely didn't follow the rules at any stage and determined how we should behave. Finally, as he is the game maker, and the game is making gods, turning ordinary raw meat, dead in the head wogs, as Hubbard termed us, into gods, into operating thetans. So he is a god maker, but none of us will ever have the ability to find out how to make gods. The only person who could determine technology, the only person who could find that out is Ron Hubbard. So he will always be superior to the rest of us. That doesn't work for me.
No, and I think what we can summarize this as, the only first dynamic that exists in Scientology is the first dynamic of L. Ron Hubbard.
Absolutely.
As the game maker who doesn't have to follow the rules. And that's the real truth of the matter.
And anything that went against his wishes would make it harder for him to be a god maker. So everything must be exactly as he wanted. And what he wanted was the demands that he made upon people. You know, when he was running his peculiar little technical film department, I don't think one of those films actually survives. Miscavige has canned the lot because they're crazy little things. I saw a few of them before they were withdrawn, but Hubbard issued them. But he was basically an absolute tyrant during that period, ensuring that nobody had any power at all. And there's a point where he was so annoyed with the quite sizable crew he'd gathered around him that he said that they would no longer have toilet tissue. And so they were going and raiding phone boxes to get the yellow pages and things like this. And you're going, you've reduced these people who were everyday people in the world out there to slaves who now have to, you know, grovel around to try and find toilet tissue. And that was how Hubbard felt about his own entourage. And that's a lesson for any Scientologist. You know, step back from this, get some information about it, and see if you can still change your mind. See if you still have the capacity to direct your own mind.
Yeah, and so it goes back to the point I made. The only true first dynamic in Scientology is L. Ron Hubbard's first dynamic. Scientology is L. Ron Hubbard's immortality project. It is his own first dynamic. And that is why he spent several $100 million with the Church's spiritual technology to bury his works in nuclear-proof underground vaults.
He left $500 million, which was initially labeled to perpetuate the name L. Ron Hubbard.
And really, that is how the occultist lives in his immortality, is to perpetuate his name. That's why I've often said Scientology is L. Ron Hubbard's personal immortality project, is his own first dynamic. It concerns him, his name, his possessions, his effort to survive as an individual, as his name beyond the death of his body. And that's ultimately what you're paying for, is his first dynamic. Given his bodily death, it became David Miscavige's first dynamic. That's what Scientology presently is. Beyond perpetuating the name of L. Ron Hubbard, it is actively David Miscavige's first dynamic. That's where your fees go. That's where your donations go.
In 1938, Ron Hubbard wrote a letter to his first wife, Polly, Margaret Louise Grubb. We call it the Skipper letter. I can reveal that it was me that released it publicly. It came out of the archives, and I gave it to Russell Miller, and away it went. It starts, Dear Skipper, which was his pet name for her. In that letter, which everybody who's ever been involved with Scientology should read, it is the single most important document, I believe, and I've seen hundreds of thousands of documents. He says, my only goal is to smash my name into history. My only goal is to smash my name into history. As we've said, $500 million is then left to do just that. And in 1990, when the first edition of what is now Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky was issued, there's a chapter in it which has not been altered in any way, in which I discuss L. Ron Hubbard's desire to be seen as a god. On the principle that you find in Chinese religions and also in Roman religion, that if somebody's name is repeated, if their name is said, then they will have this, they will become a god. There's a peculiar little piece in Robert Graves's wonderful I, Claudius. I think it's actually in the second novel, Claudius the God, but in the incredible TV series that was made of it, there's a point where Livia, who is the second wife of the Emperor Augustus, and poisons Augustus so that her son Tiberius can become emperor, where she realizes the boy who's considered an idiot, Claudius, because he has a stammer, is going to become emperor, because it's prophesied that he will, the oracle prophesies. And so she begs him, having mistreated him through his whole life, she begs him, make me a god. And to do that, all he has to do is create a temple in her name and have people say prayers to her. And I think that's what Scientology is. It's the effort to make Ron Hubbard a god, rather than the miserable, selfish, narcissistic sociopath that he actually was. And he is not the sort of person who should be celebrated. He really isn't. He's a dreadful human being. Scientology is the opposite of what it promises to be. It does not liberate people. It enslaves people.
Exactly. And giving yourself and your life energy, your life force to L. Ron Hubbard's first dynamic, or to empowering David Miscavige's psychotic first dynamic, is fundamentally insane.
And antisocial. That looking at other people, we should have compassion,
Yeah, and it leads to bondage. Really. You don't even have to go into spiritual terms. It just leads into psychological bondage, bankruptcy, suffering, early death, the things we were discussing today. So, John, this was I want to go into the other dynamics in other interviews.
Of course.
But I think it was important to show how Scientologists think of the first dynamic, what the church says it is versus how it's actually expressed, and what the evidence shows over time, over decades. So I was glad we could talk about Scientology's first dynamic and discuss this for our listeners. please do donate to John's channel to keep it going. It really does matter. It really does help educate the world on the evil that is the Church of Scientology.
Grand. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Always a pleasure.
Likewise.
I'll see you on the other side of the bridge, or maybe before that. Who knows? Thanks a lot, Jeffrey.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
The names on the wall there were not ones I knew. Their families were strangers to me. But now I know all of them all too well, and yearn for their spirits to be free. I yearn for the day no parent need fear that their children are lost or in pain. I dream of the day when the cruel tyrant falls and truth ends his murderous reign. For why did they die? Oh, why did they die? And why could they never ask why? Enough is enough. It's time to get tough before another one dies. The slaves in the Sea Org, they toil and cringe while chained in their nightmarish hell. I pray that each one of them finds their own way to wake from Miscavige's spell. Each name on the wall, they're a soul who had fallen. Their voices call out from their graves. Their names shall now haunt me until that sweet day when time brings the justice they crave. For why did they die, and why did they die, and why could they never ask why? Enough is enough, it's time to get tough before another one dies. For why did they die, and why did they die, and why could we never ask why? Enough is enough, it's time to get tough before another one dies. Before another